Welcome to Advancing Cyber, where we dive into cybersecurity issues driving today's headlines and business decisions. In every episode, we bring together a cyber attorney, a policy expert, and a tech leader to cut through the noise and talk real-world implications beyond the tech or legal jargon. I'm Kristen Flynn Goodwin, your host and an expert in cybersecurity law and incident response. From escalating nation-state cyber attacks to the implications of new laws and policies, let's advance the cyber discussion right now. Today's show features three experts that I'm thrilled to know and introduce. David Simon is at Skadden, Arps, Slate, Meagher and Flom, where he is the global co-head of the cybersecurity and data privacy practice and a partner in the firm's national security group. David has served as a Pentagon Special Counsel and Chief Cyber Counsel to the U.S. Cyberspace Solarium Commission and is qualified to practice law in both the European Union and the United States. I also know, having worked with him in the past, that he is an incredibly talented and practical outside counsel and a great colleague to work with. On the technology front, we have Jesper Johanssen here today. He has over 25 years experience across information security. He's been the chief security architect at Amazon and Robinhood. He's been the chief security architect and CISO at GoDaddy. He's got over 150 issued patents. He's run cybersecurity risk and compliance for major companies, and he's got a very new and exciting chief security architect leadership role that he's about to start very soon. So I'm thrilled to have him here today. For our policy voice, we have Jason Healey from Columbia University, where he's a senior research scholar and adjunct professor and the founder of Columbia's cyber efforts in the School of International and Public Affairs, and also a senior fellow at the Australian Security Policy Institute, which we once loved to call ASPI. He spent 3 years working as a senior policy advisor with CISA and 12 years with the Atlantic Council. He also connects deeply with the technical community because he's been on the review board for DEF CON for over a decade and with Black Hat going on 5 years. His background includes serving in the White House as Director for Cyber Infrastructure Protection, where I used to harass him endlessly, and leading the development for critical cyber defense strategies. He also served 10 years in the United States Air Force. As a reminder, the comments you hear today may reflect legal opinions, but do not constitute legal advice. So let's jump into it. Today's discussion is really going to focus a lot on artificial intelligence. AI is the most active area of technology and technology law right now. Every major product or service announcement in security seems to be AI-based. We're all awaiting the final release of the EU AI Act. We're seeing countless numbers of laws and policies under development around the world and here in the United States. Privacy and ethics have been the most active areas, and I get it. That makes a lot of sense. That's well thought out. But we're starting to see risk management and security enter the conversation. And it begs the question, why isn't more attention being paid to the role of AI as critical infrastructure? So, David, let's start with you. We're seeing laws cement the importance of AI from a privacy and from a citizen protection perspective. Why do you think that the security AI conversation is lagging behind?
Well, first off, Kristen, it's such a delight to be with you today and to join such an esteemed group for this conversation. I do think that I'm not going to do the thing that is causing the problem you've identified, but to acknowledge it. I think whenever you start talking about AI in any context, you end up in a graduate seminar or a conversation you want to exit even faster about what AI means. I think that, so there's not an alignment on that. And then even if you get further, the conversation starts to be about the perspective of developers more than the perspective of deployers and integrators. And so I think that you have both a definitional problem and also a roles and responsibilities issue. The other issue that I'd say that has prompted some challenges is that, when we start unpacking this broader question, even if you agree on what AI is and machine learning and the role of generative AI, it's really the types of infrastructure and technology implicated are different dimensions that we all know, some better than others, whether it's the chips, it's the actual algorithms and models, it's the sort of boring picks and shovels aspects that involve the energy that is needed to power the future that we all are excited to take part in. So I think that's where I think that some of this conversation has become a bit stalled. I will say there probably is relative consensus around some of those components when it comes to energy infrastructure. If you had a nuclear power plant near a city, I think there's not a lot of dissent around the role of that as critical infrastructure. But I think that there's a lot of things in between. And so that's probably why the technology is moving fast. And also there's not alignment on what do we mean when we say that. But I think we'll get there sooner rather than later.
So it's a definitional problem. Do you think that is it intimidating? I mean, and I'll ask Jay here too, right? Because AI means so many different things. Is it something that we're going to have to ask Jesper to come in and define for governments to really spend more time from a policy perspective explaining what are the different types of AI and ML in play?
Yeah, certainly specificity helps so much when we're coming to law and policy. Do we, and David mentioned this, do we mean specifically, we've got the infrastructure part of it, we've got the chips, we've got the models, we've got the training data. And I think the more specificity we can add to that, the better. But also the specificity on what it is that we would want to gain. Because to some degree saying, is it critical infrastructure? Of course it is. How could it not be? If you say it isn't, then you probably don't think it's that important and transformative to the United States. And you can't really have, I think, the position that it's absolutely transformative to the future, and it's not critical infrastructure. But when we say critical infrastructure, we mean that to some degree just mean it's super important. But for a former government person, right? For when I first got to meet you, Kristen, right? It's more than that. Think about elections. Well, we knew elections were important, but declaring them critical infrastructure meant that the government now had formal mechanisms that it could use. It would say, good, we're going to stand up a sector risk management agency so we can formally work on this. It allowed money, it allowed grants to flow more easily in specific areas. For other places, critical infrastructure unlocks regulation. It makes some regulation a little bit easier. I'm not quite sure what the gains are going to be for the government to call AI critical infrastructure. And before we do, we have to say, okay, what's the point? Which of those things are we trying to unlock?
Okay, so if we go way back to May of 1998, because critical infrastructure as a definition is now old enough to rent a car as of last year, Presidential Decision Directive 63 said, critical infrastructures are those physical and cyber-based systems essential to the minimum operations of the economy and the government. So that's a pretty high bar. And there is an argument that AI is not there yet. Although I would argue that in the event you are looking at incident response or you are trying to find data, machine learning, certainly for companies that are involved in investigating incidents, absolutely is. I mean, Jesper, what's your thought on that? Can you do big data analytics today without ML? And can you decouple ML from AI?
No, there's no decoupling it. And I think this is in many ways a terminology and language problem, right? It's kind of funny that we're talking about the Advancing Cyber podcast because it wasn't all that many years ago that we could tell whether somebody lived and worked inside or outside the Capital Beltway. If they used the word cyber ever, they were inside the Beltway. If they were outside the Beltway, they never used that term, right? It just wasn't done. And the technology side of security would almost kind of laugh at people when they talked about cybersecurity because it made us think of, movies and things. I also remember back, if we're going to go back in time, in either late 2001 or early 2002, I can't remember exactly when, I was at the Naval Surface Warfare College for a symposium on protecting critical infrastructure. And it was kind of strange to me because critical infrastructure were things like the telephone system, the financial industry, data systems, all of which run on the backbone of the internet, which nobody thought to define as critical infrastructure, right? And we still haven't defined this. There's talk today, should we define data centers as critical infrastructure? Well, let's see. If a data center falls over, all of these other things that we do know are critical infrastructure will not function, right? And it's not one data center that would cause that. It's dozens of them that would literally cause that kind of a meltdown. And so obviously it's critical infrastructure. And I think the part of the problem is that we just don't have these definitions yet. We don't have agreement on those. And with AI, we don't actually even understand what are people really doing with it and how critical is it to those business functions, right? If I call my airline to try to update my flight information, will that work if their AI systems aren't functioning? And chances are probably not, right? I think we need to start there and come up with things that we agree on that we actually care about.
I love that point. This is Jay, because you talked about functions. And this was something that CISA, the U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, was working on for a while, was saying, let's think about the national critical functions. Like, what are the functions that the nation needs? And let's put our focus on those functions and ensure those functions are resilient. I don't know if they're still doing quite as much work on that as when Chris Krebs was director, but that's one way to think about the AI. We don't think about AI itself, which is going to be changing, but okay, well, how does it fit in with finance? How does it fit in with providing energy? How does it fit in with the other things that society and economy depend on?
I actually think the way we need to think about this is AI is a new form of compute. And when I say compute, I mean the process of computing things, right? It is simply essentially another programming language, another type of computer. That's, I think, how we need to think about it. And that means that we can't really tell exactly where the boundaries of it are.
I assume it also means that we can't wait, right? Because
absolutely.
Part of what I look at is that our friends on the privacy side and our friends on the ethics side, they immediately jumped on the implications of what happens. And for those of us on the security side, we tend to look at security issues from the perspective of best practices and not from a regulatory or prescriptive approach. So we take our time and, we use incidents to go drive action instead of moving forward from a regulatory perspective. So let's use a hypothetical. We know Russia likes to drop Christmas surprises. So let's assume this holiday season, it's December 2024, and we learn that there's a Russian actor, Midnight Blizzard, of SolarWinds fame, compromises at least 4, maybe more AI service providers. Let's assume they're focusing on enterprise users of those AI services, and they're looking at intelligence gathering. How are those enterprises using AI in their enterprises? Are they using them for help desks? Are they using them for code creation? Are they using AI in security? They want to know what those enterprises are using AI for in their ecosystem. How does the U.S. handle a major incident like that? SolarWinds was really challenging. You have a major incident like Snowflake, where it was much quieter. Let's imagine there's a major incident involving multiple service providers and dozens, if not more, enterprises in the US, and it's AI-based. What does that look like? Jay, how does that start from a government perspective?
As you're walking through this great example, I was thinking backward of saying, what would we want to have in place? And if we call this critical infrastructure, what would we expect to have in place? So I've been vice chair of the FS-ISAC, right? We might want, in this circumstances, for there to be an AI-ISAC, to be able to handle all of those operational elements that they can work amongst themselves like we did amongst the banks. We might want an equivalent of what we call in the business the Sector Coordinating Council. Right, so the ISAC is there to handle the operational elements, the Sector Coordinating Council, and that's kind of CISO below. The Coordinating Council is CISO and above to handle the larger scale issues. For us in finance, that was, hey, are the markets going to be able to open tomorrow? So I'd be very curious, and I think this would be a great paper for someone listening to this podcast, to put together and say, okay, what would that structure look like? Because right now, Christina, boy, I don't know, right? I think it would be a mess. CISA would be struggling on this. They don't have the connections. I would guess they don't have the deep enough connections out of CISA. They don't have the deep enough connections anywhere. I might even imagine it's going to be someone like Ben Buchanan out of the White House that knows everybody and is able to step in.
I think it's a really interesting question, right? CISA, in fairness, did host an AI exercise back in June, and I know that they're working on an AI incident response playbook. And that's a great first start.
That is.
But I think to your point, more is needed, and it's not clear that all the right players know how to come to the table. I mean, but think about it from the victim perspective. David, I'm assuming as a lawyer, calls are going to come in. Am I a victim? Am I not? How are you thinking about that?
It's a great question, Kristen. And I think the points that have been made by Jay about the level of preparedness of the U.S. government are very fair and to some extent an overstatement. Look, every day as part of our global incident response practice, clients reach out and they have an issue and it's not always clear how it begins. And sometimes we see patterns across sectors. Some sectors are better prepared than others. So if you were to talk about a series of larger financial institutions, they've thought about this. It's something that they're expected to test for, and there's failover procedures. If you're looking at sectors like automotive, it may be a little less clear. If you're looking at the way cloud regions are set up, a little bit less clear. As I think that at the end of the day, from a U.S. government perspective, it may seem like a spectator sport. They may be hearing about it from lots of organizations. They may be hearing about it from some of their contractors and then, frankly, responding to what they see in the news. And it's not quite right that outside counsel and cyber incident response firms in the private sector are on the front lines, but it can seem that way. So when you look at attacks on critical infrastructure and the patterns that we start to see, I think that the story does look a little bit like a cyber incident response exercise. And often what's unfortunate is that the details as to what really went wrong are often not revealed either in a reasonable amount of time or ever. So I think that the CrowdStrike Friday experience is one example where I think there's still some open questions. I think there are a series of other technology failure stories that I think many of us have seen over the course of our careers that may today have been seen as an AI incident, when in fact they're really just a function of a lack of understanding about how technologies depend on one another.
It's a great point. I pull on Jesper for a second, because one of the things I do worry about in an AI incident is that the technology itself is so complex. And, when you have to use AI to analyze an incident itself, you can get, I love this term, I think it's one of my favorite cyber or technical terms ever. You can get hallucinations. Like the output may not be the same every time when you're using the same technology running against the same data set. That's amazing. So that's where, Jesper, how do you help coach government leaders into understanding the problem space there when you can't get a consistent read on the problem?
I think this is going to be one of the more interesting parts of this. We're going to have a conversation, and it's going to have to take a long time. And I think one of the really interesting pieces, you mentioned the SolarWinds compromise. I actually wonder if an AI compromise at the provider level, so at one of the AI company levels, is almost more like what we thought Supermicro was when we thought that there were chips injected, in the sense that you can't even tell. Because if the hallucinations, is the model trustworthy, right? And how do you even tell? How do you reason about what the model should look like? Even in the best of circumstances, if a model is exactly operating the way it should, computing is supposed to be deterministic, right? The first thing we do when we have a problem in computing is we restart the computer and try again, right? And it's supposed to do the same thing. That is part of what it should do. Of course, it doesn't, but there are reasons for that.
Or we restarted 21 times, according to Craig.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Hello, IT. Have you tried turning it off and back on again? Right. AI is not deterministic. It was never meant to be deterministic, right? Humans aren't deterministic. And the whole point of it is we're trying to make a computer simulate what a human could do, except faster. So how do we tell who the victims are? I love what Jason was talking about earlier. We have this potential problem of, how do we undo the problem? How do we detect that there's a problem? How do we detect where the problem actually is? And how do we roll it back? Right. And that was why I think the Supermicro incident, whether it was true or not, we can discuss in a different forum. But how do you roll it back? How do you start over in that kind of a situation when the fundamental infrastructure is no longer trustworthy? That's not a question of rebooting. It's not a question of installing a patch, right? you don't even know what damage was caused by this. And that's the part that we have to go figure out. And I think we need governments to understand that. We need business leaders to understand that.
So, Kristen, I had a question for you because of your Microsoft experience, because it strikes me that part of me is really pessimistic on this, but I might imagine that, Microsoft opens its umbrella of protection to OpenAI, right? Google, who's invested in Anthropic, could say, okay, good, we're going to put Mandiant on there. Because many of the providers that you're laying out in this scenario have large investments from technology companies that have really capable defenses. Do you think that's reasonable the way I laid that out, that they would be providing that? And do you think that puts us in a better place than maybe, is there room for optimism there?
Yeah, I mean, I can't comment on any past employers or what any of the big companies might do, but I think what's different about AI is that there's a lot of players in the space that are not in the traditional realm of IT. And so as I try to think about what incident response looks like, in the olden days of 2007 and 8, right? You had the easy time of simply issuing a patch, pushing out your update, the world knew where to go. In the cloud era, now services auto update and put out a blog post, and it's easier to understand. And there's a communication and collaboration that goes on in the background with CISA or other governments to explain the impact and any steps that need to happen. Or if the attack is something that cannot be mitigated in the cloud, then what needs to be done on the enterprise end. On the AI front, it's still not clear what the responsibilities are going to be on either side, right? Because if the manipulation, and Jesper, keep me honest here, right? But if the manipulation is done in the client's instantiation of the AI engine, then the customer's going to have to go figure out, to Jesper's point, where's the source of truth? Or if it's a broad, publicly available AI engine, because I deliberately didn't go to consumer available for this scenario, because then you're talking big companies. But if it's an enterprise one and the enterprise is manipulating it on its own, and then you got to go figure out where was the point of origin of the attack, and when did that point of truth become tainted? That's going to be really hard to go figure out. So there's a whole new era of forensics that's going to have to go get created to go figure that out. So from an AI perspective, and then a threat intelligence perspective, that's amazing and exciting and really, really hard. And I don't know how that gets birthed.
Was it even tainted input? I mean, we've already seen AI models producing hallucinations because the input was simply bad, right? How do you take advantage of that?
Yeah, it's just going to take some time. I think to CISA's credit, they're working on this now. A lot more exercises are going to have to happen. I think the EU poses some really interesting challenges for American companies because they're already ahead from a regulatory perspective. And I think that there may be some regulatory movement that comes here. I don't know, David, I'm spitballing. I don't know if you've been seeing anything coming or any indicators in Europe that might lead to more heat coming from Europe from an AI incident response perspective. But I would expect to see the Europeans paying more attention to this. But I think there's a lot more work to be done. Are you seeing anything in Europe on the IR side?
We are, having spent the better part of 2 years enjoying, champagne and fries and beer and a few other things in Brussels. And one thing I noticed is that it doesn't take that much for a bright idea that someone develops in a college class to end up in a Word document somewhere in an EU institution, and 5 years later it becomes GDPR. And now we have the AI Act, we have the AI Liability Directive. I won't even get started. So I do think that even as we wait for efforts to interpret the 5-in-1 executive order that the administration put out about AI here in the United States, organizations are still reacting to the sort of framework set out by the EU AI Act. What does that mean for incident response? And what we're seeing live is that companies are evaluating in real time before they've gone through their proper compliance process. Is the system, the vendor, the supply chain risk that we've just been looking at? Is it implicating these rules? Would it be a high risk system? So that's one way from an AI Act perspective. Companies are beginning to think about that. And why is that? In part because there's uncertainty as to which regulators are relevant. It depends on the country. Some have spoken out and said that they're likely to play that role. And so if it's the same one you're reporting to for, personal data breach purposes, like the Data Protection Commissioner, for example, the ICO in the UK or the Irish Data Protection Commissioner, that's something you would consider. And then the other is, in the cybersecurity context in the EU, a big focus on resiliency. So the DORA, the Digital Operational Resiliency Act, already takes this into consideration without specifically calling out AI, because ultimately most financial institutions and many that weren't that regulated have to think about who their important IT service providers are. And if they have an outage, whether it's because of AI or not, that's something that has to be reported. So there's a whole range of supply chain and digital resiliency related rules in the EU, which have had a pretty global impact on institutions, tech and financial. And you could look at other sectors and say you're seeing something similar. The other example that I'll give in the EU, which is creating a lot of stir in the AI context, is the greater focus on harmonization of so-called sovereign cloud. So you have the European Union's focus on cloud certification. And as we understand the need to have extraordinary access to cloud resources to have meaningful use of AI and LLMs, there'll be a greater focus on how the different kinds of FedRAMP-like regimes will be at play. So the kind of incident reporting you think of in that context will also be at the beginning of all of this.
Oh, I love that. And I love that because you really highlight the fact that, particularly at a sector level, like DORA is financial services and supply chain is aiming at a lot of different sectors. And in the United States, we have not taken up the mantle of cybersecurity regulation for the sector. We don't deal with things at the sector level. And so I think that makes it even harder to deal with cybersecurity regulation for AI. California seems to be taking that up. Whether Gavin Newsom signs the AI bills that are on his desk, TBD, but at least for safety measures for very large language models, California seems to be making this debate. Is catastrophic risk the right starting point to be debating cybersecurity and safety for AI here in the US? Should we be starting at a different point to get the security conversation rolling? And Jay, why is this so hard at the federal level? Like you spend so much time living in and having been in government. Is the reason we keep spinning our wheels in this conversation simply because we had, 16 different congressional committees that have jurisdiction over cyber, that we keep ending up in the same conversation over and over again?
Yeah, it's tough enough. I know we all love what CIS is doing and what they're trying to do and what the rest of the federal government, but there's a lot to be done, and it can be difficult and confusing, right? The government has enough difficulty regulating finance, but we all use money every day. We kind of get how money works, and yet it's difficult to try and get our heads around the larger system and what protections are adequate and how to regulate it. We all use energy, right? We all kind of understand something about electricity, and you flip the switch. Much more than any of us have an understanding of AI, right? Other than a small group, this is super confusing. And the government has enough trouble trying to hire and train and retain enough people in the boring infrastructures that are relatively easy to get our head around. And so even those of us that hold CISA in our hearts are going to have difficulty imagining, or any government agency, getting their arms to have enough AI folks to be able to do this intelligently. It's going to be interesting to come across that. I like the idea of trying to break the bits apart, right? As I was listening to Jesper, David, and yourself, right, of hearing how much of what we're talking about and the things that we're arguing as problems or solutions are about capability or maturity, right? Running exercises, getting muscle memory for exercises, having capability to do incident response and detection properly within a company or across a sector or subsector. And some of it is, this stuff is just confusing because it's AI and we don't know if the model is going to get hit, right? It's nonlinear and we don't always know what's happening inside the black box. That's a different set of problems. And so we can be clear in which ones, right? Hey, if we're going to build out capability, if we're going to run exercises, that's much more easy. that's saying, all right, we're gonna regulate, and you have to have a CISO. You have to, here's the level of accountability we want from the board. Here's what due diligence is going to mean. That's all relatively okay to do management-based kind of regulation there. If we start saying, right, here's what the model ought to be doing and behaving, and you need to know if someone's dorking with the model, that gets into, I would think, a lot deeper things, but I defer to Jesper and David on those.
Aren't we just backing into that, though? I mean, by not having a regulator, we watch the New York Department of Financial Services has actually what I think is a wonderful regulation. I often tell CISOs that I work with, if you don't have a place to start there. It's a really nice piece of legislation that lays out some clear basics for companies of what should be in an information security program if you don't know where to start, along with the NIST cybersecurity framework. But we don't have a regulator in the US. Should we? Or is it okay that we back into this space and continue to let ourselves go through this regulation by best practices and piecemeal? Jesper, you look like you want to say something.
I do, because I love what Jay just talked about in terms of, we know what money looks like. I'm actually going to dispute that. We know what fiat currency issued by a government looks like. But there are other forms of money these days, right? And then we can argue about all kinds of things relating to that. But the fact of the matter is, we don't have ways to regulate that right now. And I love that you brought out MYDFS. It is the only regulatory regime in the United States, at least that I'm aware of right now, that regulates cryptocurrency in any way. And we can't decide how to regulate money, which is kind of interesting because money's been around for a long time, right? But one would think that we'd figure that out. We don't have a national privacy framework in the United States. We don't have regulation for that. We haven't decided what that needs to look like. So I'm not surprised, right? And I think that a lot of this is going to end up coming down to best practices. And I think one of the really problematic things right now is there aren't any. There are sort of several things, right? There's what does the supplier relationship look like when it comes to Gen AI? Can we consider it to be the same as any other supplier relationship? I actually don't think we can. And the reality is, even a company that isn't directly using AI probably has a supplier that is in some way, whether you know it or not. So that's one part of it. How do you troubleshoot it? We don't have the technical infrastructure for that. How do you rectify any kind of a problem? We haven't figured those kinds of things out. So the best practices frameworks are missing as well, which is normal at this stage for any technology adoption. That's been the case with every single technology we've ever seen. And we always also know that the first use cases for any technology are the unsavory ones. If the technology isn't used for criminal purposes, it doesn't work.
So then using criminal purposes as a connection, I think then would law enforcement and law enforcement access to data become a pivot here? Because law enforcement will see abuse of AI and law enforcement will want access to data. I mean, we've been recently seeing Twitter in Brazil or X in Brazil in the headlines. The CEO of Telegram in the headlines in France. I mean, these are not new issues. The Cloud Act in the United States in 2018, if I'm not mistaken, was a solution to help deal with access to data for the cloud in the United States and in Europe. Will that help deal with some of the uncertainty around AI, or is that just me being wishful that we need more certainty around AI and it's not going to happen? I mean, David, do you have any thoughts on if that law is going to evolve or we're too far out?
I don't think we're too far out, because in some parts of the world, there's regulate first, innovate never. So, I mean, in some parts of the world, AI innovation is almost illegal. So
I'm going to save that. It's a great quote. Thank you.
I mean, look, I think the FOOB is great, but if you're a scientist or dreaming about building a new, innovation that's going to change our technology world, I wouldn't start doing it in a variety of EU states. Now, I do think that we have a lot to contend with already. There's a conversation that's ongoing between some part of Governor Newsom's desk and various EU institutions on AI regulation. And you can point to existing laws like GDPR. I actually had a conversation as part of our AI summit early this week with Dale Sunderland, the Data Protection Commissioner. And because it was Chatham House, I'm not going to go into depth, but I think the relevance of him and other data protection commissioners in this space is well established, because there's a lot of personal data at issue. But then if you zoom out from like the data privacy piece in the EU, I think there's a lot in the United States that's already relevant, because if you have an AI failure, you already have a technology set of issues. So your sector-specific regulator imposes on you suspicious activity reporting, like a financial institution, or if you're an energy company, you have to report because there's a reliability failure in the transportation sector. I think what's challenging from a governance perspective and from a policy perspective is that these laws require reporting to different bodies with different structures, different levels of security, and they don't roll up into one place. It's not like there's a SIM for all that. And the other thing is, organizations have tremendous regulatory risk in the United States. It's high enough when it comes to cyber, given the type of investigations and plaintiffs firms that come after companies, because they're worse than the extortionists that ask for ransom. But I think on top of all that, we have Europeans coming up with the concept of the AI liability directive, which basically would mean that everyone's liable for AI regardless of where you are in the life cycle of the supply chain. And I think that makes it even more untenable. So I think what government can do that would make a big difference is say, look, here's some liability shields. Information sharing around AI needs to be different and better, because the current liability shields around cyber threat information sharing don't really cover content, and they don't cover the kind of misuse cases that we all are worried about. So I think there's some places to begin. I think for everyone who's considering innovation in a government chair right now, it'd be useful to say, how can I protect my industry and companies from what's going on in the EU? How can I make sure that these liability directives and regimes stop at the channel and don't come across the Atlantic?
Do we have a challenge with the IT sector being too monolithic, in that because IT is so large, and, going back to Jesper's earlier point, cyber was beltway, IT was everything else, that because IT is so large, that it creates a little bit of a too big to fail problem. If we look at, as Jay pointed out, the need for an AI-ISAC, the need for more specificity in how we treat these domains, so that a regulator can have the ability to regulate, or at least more effectively manage, AI, cloud, legacy, and some of the burn down of the old stuff, open source, then we start to give ourselves more of a fair fight. Or should we stay locked at that super level of IT, because that is the single truth of our sector? What makes the most sense? And I'll ask Jesper first from a technology perspective, and then I'll ask Jay from a government organizational perspective.
I think we do need to look at it as an IT problem for a number of reasons. One, security is always an afterthought in IT. We always innovate first and then worry about how to secure it. It's always been the case. It's the case here as well. It comes later. In the worst case scenario, we don't figure out how to protect it until after the biggest incident we've seen. But we do have to look at IT because of the fact that AI is essentially a new form of compute, right? And if we look at it through that lens, it becomes clear that it's foundational to all of the other things we're doing in IT. So it's going to underlie all of them in ways that we probably can't really foresee right now, and can't really disentangle very well. We can't really see it, right? We all interact with AI every single day, whether we open up ChatGPT and type a question into it or not. We're still interacting with AI, or AI interacts with us in ways that we don't see. And so we have to look at it through that holistic perspective. And we have to think about it as a compute infrastructure component.
Yeah, I really like that point. And first, as you're talking about, we always add this afterwards. And for folks that say, well, it hasn't always, we find quotes back to 1972 that say security has to be included by design. It can't be added on as an afterthought. Like 1972. So we're 50 plus years into secure by design. So I agree with Jesper. But I would just be, on the line of some of your question, Kristen, is in some of our answers, we've been talking about regulating AI. And I don't think, at least that's not what I mean in this. I mean to have expectations at a minimum, and maybe requirements for security and resilience and governance for the companies involved. And that's why I'm glad you brought up the AI exercise that CISA did, right? We can start saying, all right, if you're going to be doing these things that we're going to have a dependence on, whether we call you critical infrastructure or not, you really need to have an ISAC. You really need to have these governance mechanisms in place. If something bad really happens, can you reach to one of your investors that's going to be a cybersecurity provider for you if you need the surge, right? Those are all reasonable expectations that society and governments can put on these companies for the level of dependence we're going to be having on their product. And none of that needs to necessarily be regulating the companies or regulating AI, right? It's just a reasonable set of expectations or even requirements so that we don't have larger failures down the line, so that we're able to be more resilient, so that our dependence, our trust on these, not just the technology, but on the companies themselves, that they're living up to that.
Well, two challenges there, right? You can do the FCC model and, notice of proposed rulemaking as a great approach from a regulatory perspective of bringing companies into a space. Or you can have the best practices model of letting companies iterate on their own. That's another approach. You can have the GSA contracting model and write requirements into contracts, and maybe they get procured, maybe they don't. It depends on how expensive it is. Which one wins?
Another model, right? I mean, there's carrot sticks and pulpits, right? I mean, you could be, if we're Ann Neuberger, for example, at the White House, we might call in the companies and their funders and say, hey, look, here's a set of things that we would like to see happen. And we're talking about a relatively small number of companies who all have very large investors that all deeply are involved in security. So there might be other ways that we can do this rather than the Federal Register.
The other thing I'll just add into the mix is that I think that there may be some wisdom in this status quo tech regulation in the United States, which is to say we regulate particular harms we're worried about as opposed to the technology itself. And in the context of AI, both because the definitional issues and because it's evolving so quickly, it may be more useful to think about the misuse cases, witting and unwitting, that we're worried about and focus our regulation on that where there's not regulation already. So it's already against the law to use very dangerous weapons that could have dramatic consequences across the population, regardless of how technology or less exciting means are leveraged. So I think the question is, how do we apply the existing law? Now, to the extent that we're really focused on these significant concerns, I think it's important to ask, are they real today? Are we really living in a moment where the futuristic concerns that have motivated AI regulation in Europe are present? And if not, then we shouldn't focus too much on them. So to land the plane on this point, I would say it's about some key use cases and misuse cases, as opposed to regulating models, regulating data, regulating, the chips that they're on. The only exception I'd say is that you think export controls are really important. I do think that kinds of controls that would be relevant for maintaining U.S. competitiveness or competitiveness of like-minded countries is very important, because I think there is a scenario that we all need to worry about where we regulated ourselves into oblivion on this, and we are tying both hands behind our back for the future of conflict.
I think that's a great point, and one where the U.S. and Europe are not necessarily on the same page from an export control perspective. So I think how the U.S. thinks about that is a really important marker to put down. So I like that a lot. I am hopeful that by pushing on the concept of AI and incident response, it gets not just CISA, but also the intelligence community forcing the conversation within government to think about threat intelligence, indicators of compromise, developing new tactics, techniques, and procedures so that when the incident does happen, they're also exercising and they're preparing to think about how do they want to engage with companies that they haven't had to work with before. Jesper, any closing thoughts from you on what you think will be essential for the development of best practices for the government side as we prepare for the future incident?
I think the most important thing is going to be a solid continuing dialogue between the government and the industry. We develop far better regulations when we work together than when it's done in isolation. And that's always been the case with governments, right? The adversarial relationship leads to problems, leads to companies switching markets. It leads to ways to work around the problem. And it also leads to regulations that are not clear and that are not uniformly enforced. We've seen that with FedRAMP, for example, where some companies pass with a particular set of requirements and other companies fail. with the exact same set of implementations. We need that prescriptiveness in the regulations, and we need the flexibility to update them as things change in the marketplace. And I think what all that implies is it is critical infrastructure, but I think it is part of the overall IT ecosystem as a critical infrastructure.
Okay, so that's AI as a yes from Jesper. David, how about you? What are your final thoughts? AI is CI.
I don't think that it is. I think that there are components that are relevant for the use cases and misuse cases that we're all focused on that are quite evidently regulated in different respects. But I think it'd be dangerous to jump to a conclusion that any particular technology is per se critical infrastructure. And that's if we're sort of in our own regulatory sandbox. Already in the EU, under the NIS2 rules, technology that's far less exciting than AI is effectively, regulated in that regard. And I would say I'd just draw a comparison between this question of is AI critical infrastructure to the question of is infrastructure in outer space, all of it's critical infrastructure. I just think that there are components that could be, there are certainly aspects that are already, but is it as a definitional matter? I think the answer is no. And I think that the conversation should really move in the direction of what kinds of use cases or effects are we really looking to regulate?
Can I ask if that's a time-bounded question? Do you think if I asked you in 2026 that changes, or do you think that it's still a use case conversation?
I think it's a use case conversation, and I come to this because of having the experience as a lawyer in the Pentagon, doing weapons reviews and cyber weapons reviews. It's really not about the digits or the technology. It's whether it can be used in a way that's consistent with law or good principles. And I think the same would apply to this. And I think it becomes dangerous to start designating technology that way, because the next thing you know, we start talking about rules about transparency and arms control. And that just doesn't really work very well when it comes to objects that are not tangible, physical, and can be put on a shelf and tracked.
And how about you, Jay? AI is critical infrastructure. What's your vote?
Yes, without a doubt. And especially because of the way you touched on it when you introduced this. Because you said, for example, the government would need to do threat intelligence to those companies and to share in specific ways. And within the government, if someone is not clearly critical infrastructure, sometimes those pathways just can't be created because there's some bureaucrat that says, no, they're not critical infrastructure. We don't have the authority to do this. And I saw this a lot in my time at CIT. Well, maybe not a lot in CIT, but we would see that. And it's the lawyer's first question. Do we have the authority? And so if we call AI critical infrastructure, even if we do nothing else, as long as they're just declared, it just means that those pathways can work well to, for example, share threat intelligence with them in useful ways. As far as your larger question about regulation and AI, I'm coming down against because there's too many category issues. Putting requirements on the companies, I'm all for, especially I would start on response. Because if we say we want to do response better in case there's an incident, like you proposed in your scenario, Krista, let me flip it around. When we're talking about requirements for better security and regulating for that, all sort of antibodies come up. There's all sort of resistance because you're going to live in innovation. You're going to do X, you're going to do Y and Z. If you say we want to improve response, you get far fewer antibodies together. So if we're having our conversation about, let's have an ISAC, let's have a sector coordinating council, let's have a government coordinating council, let's do exercises. You don't build those antibodies. We can start there over the short term, build trust, build capability within the government, actually get these companies thinking even more about security and move on from there.
I think that's right. Although I think that David's point cannot be lost, because where we were when we defined critical infrastructure 25 years ago at a sector-based approach no longer holds up in the modern era. And I think that we've watched this as we evolved after the 9/11 era. We've watched it over time where just because a sector has been designated critical infrastructure, not everything in it is critical. And I think that when you apply the concept of critical infrastructure to technology, that becomes extremely clear, where online gaming might be critical infrastructure to my teens, but it is not necessarily critical infrastructure, even though it is IT. And so therefore, when we think about AI and ML and its use cases, there will be many that will be absolutely highly critical and already are highly critical. But until we are able to have a new approach for critical infrastructure that allows us to actually, frankly, talk prioritization, because not everything can be critical in critical infrastructure, I think we're going to be having to wrestle with this concept for a very long time.
Yeah, and to me, this is the White House's latest effort to build on what used to be called the Section 9 list of critical infrastructure entities. They've now expanded that. Originally, IT companies were specifically excluded. Now that's no longer true. If we were to just say, look, let's just focus on a few systemically important entities that are in the AI space, and let's look at those entities and think about the expectation at the entity level, using those existing things that the White House has already delegated to DHS and CISA, I would love to look at that approach. I think that would be super fruitful.
One thing it guarantees is that we've got a lot more to talk about. I want to thank David Simon, Jason Healey, and Jesper Johanssen for being with us. This has been a fantastic conversation and a tremendous amount of fun. This has been Advancing Cyber. We hope you enjoyed the discussion. I want to thank our Advancing Cyber team with management support from DC Cyber Communications, our sound engineer and law student Tanner Wilburn, and our undergraduate research interns Layla Moeller and Carolina Oxenstierna. You can share ideas and recommendations via email at cyber@advancingcyber.com. Security is a community, and we always look forward to hearing from you. This is your host, Kristen Flint Goodwin, saying thank you, patch your devices, and please turn on MFA.